Thought I was turning myself on, I was turning myself off, So. Hey, it's good to see everyone survive Thanksgiving out there. There's some truth to the fact, it slows you down, but really you got to think about eating that bird. That bird's not known for great flying skills, and sometimes after you eat, you kind of settle down with it. But anyway, we're doing this series called Under the Sun, kind of out of Ecclesiastes, that there are different seasons under the sun. And I think it's important that we understand it because life isn't always the same. And it's kind of aggravating because when you really start to understand the game, so to speak, all of a sudden, all the rules kind of change. There's change that takes place, and there's routines that take place. There's failures that come down the pike. There's successes, and knowing how to manage those different seasons through the grace of God is very important. So this morning, last week, Tyler and Lindsay talked about routine. This week, we're going to talk about seasons of change. Now, growing up, I moved a lot. Probably have moved not as much as Darren, but probably about 25, 26 times in my life. And it's kind of in my DNA. We've been here 20-some years, but we've moved 4 times here because there's this time clock that goes off in me. But as a kid, my dad was a Methodist minister in the Florida Conference, and we moved like clockwork every few years. And it was somewhat hard. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was hard, but you spend about 4 months of those few years in the moving process, either packing up or whatever. And then for the first year and a half when you move into a new community, you are kind of on the outside looking into the neighborhood kids, trying to make some friendships there. Or at school, you were the new kid, always, every so often, and you'd have to kind of try to work there. And then my dad was very involved in the church, so you were there with children's group or youth group or whatever, and you'd have to work your way in there. And then about the year and a half, 2-year point, you found a couple friends you could hang out with. And sometimes, there's a couple times I developed best friends, and then you moved. Started the whole thing over. So that's kind of the change that was almost a routine for me. I had so much change, it became a routine. Lori, my wife, on the other hand, they still have the same house. They're still there to this day. And Lori, she didn't change the outside of the house, but she loves changing the inside of a house. A living room to her is like a puzzle. How many different ways can I arrange the furniture? A bedroom, how many different ways? And it's hard. Sometimes you want to have the light on when you go jump in the bed because it might be in a different location. It's just that way. And then the other thing Lori does is she loves to organize, come up with a better place or better something to store something in. And it's like, everyone should know this is a better place, but I had no idea. And one of the things that happens is with the Band-Aids. The Band-Aids are always on a journey somewhere in the house. I remember at our older house, she had them in the kids' bedroom, because the kids had access, so she had the Band-Aids there. Second drawer, I'd go and get them, and then all of a sudden, no, we're going to put it in the cabinet of the kids' drawers. Oh, we're going to bring it over in our cabinet. We're going to put it in your first drawer. And then she decided that, most accidents, since it's on the second floor, let's bring them downstairs and put them in the medicine where they're there. And then I think the last place, she says, we need to put them in your truck because you're real susceptible. So throughout our house and our property, there's this trail of blood, as I'm looking for the Band-Aids, So anyway, having said that, change can be humorous, fun, healthy, but it can also be very tough, and it can turn very unhealthy. Last week, like we said, there's routine, that we go through, and it's like, well, tomorrow's going to look like today, and next week's going to look like this week, and it just goes on and on. Where change, it's different. It's like, man, I don't know what happened this last week, and I don't know what's going to happen this week. It's like the ground starts to move under your feet. It's hard to get a stride because at every corner something is approaching you different that you haven't seen before, that you haven't touched or you haven't handled before. One of the moves that was tough on me, I moved in 10th grade from South Florida to Jacksonville, which is also known as Cowtown. It's more like southern Georgia, where Fort Lauderdale was a very hip place, cool place. And I was at a brand new school. in South Florida. It was, in fact, I started in 9th grade. We would have been the first graduating class. All the teachers were under 30. It was just really cool. And I had my best friend was down there. My first childhood sweetheart was down in Fort Lauderdale. And we moved in 10th grade up to Jacksonville, Florida. And there I am, the neighborhood situation. It was Main Street Methodist Church. So the neighborhood situation, you didn't go out and find a friend in the neighborhood. You found drug dealers and winos and, people shooting heroin. It was just not the best place to go out in the neighborhood. Well, at the school was unaccredited. High school. And they had space problems, and the way they solved it, they had split sessions. So my session was from 6 in the morning to 12 o'clock noon. And that's all, you're out of school. So there wasn't a lot of activity, no people at schools. And, there were some problems in that school, too. A couple kids had been killed at school. And then the church, it was a weird situation because down in South Florida, we didn't have any seniors that had the opportunity to play varsity sports right out of 9th grade and just really was connected to sports. But when I was kind of I felt like I was kind of cool at that youth group, but when I came to this new youth group, man, all the guys were bigger and faster and smarter, and they all drove nice cars. And it didn't occur to me till later that it started in 9th grade, but when you graduated from high school, you stayed in the youth group. And I remember there was kids in our youth group, our senior high youth group, that were in college. We even had boys that were 25 years old, and they were all bigger, drove nice cars. You didn't have a chance with any of the girls because all these guys were way ahead of you, And so it was a real tough change, and we face changes like that. There's several changes that they're determined that are unhealthy, like shift changes. It's okay to do it occasionally, but a lot of police officers go through this where, I don't know, Andy, if you go through this where, first shift, second, third, it makes you cranky. Of course, cranky with a gun is not a good, But anyway, there's those changes you go through, and they say that's not really healthy for your sleep habits or your emotions or stuff like that. It's like you're on jet lag several times a year. Another thing they say is not good is elderly people, they get in a pattern. It's hard to move them on the stress level. It's equal to a death of a mate for elderly person to move later in life. And so there's these things that go on. Another very devastating thing is divorce. It can be real hard on people. There's a lot of change, Sometimes kids, as they go through divorce, all of a sudden, they move out of their house, their familiarity, their neighborhood, and now they're living in 2 houses. Now they're dealing with different sets of grandparents, someone else that wants to pinch their cheek that they don't even know who they are. They smell even different than their other grandparents. So you got all this stuff going on, and all of a sudden, maybe there's a new stepmother or a new stepdad that enters the picture, and that's change, and it's tough. When I look over the whole season of life, there are definitely seasons of life where there is a lot of change. One of them happens as you graduate from high school. Anybody over here going to be graduating from high school this year? And you're going to go into kind of a season of change. There's one. I think there's one down there on the end. Hey, congratulations. I hope you make it, but just, don't mess up. There's a few more months left. So anyway, you go through this season of change. And what happens is, you might go to junior college, but then you move away from home. And in about a 5-7 year period, you move away from home, you develop a new set of friends. All of a sudden, you realize that you can stay up as late as you want. Sometimes there's a boy or girl that you meet during that 5-7 years period. Sometimes you get married, you start a career, you move out on your own home, and you have a kid, and then you end up where Tyler and Lindsay were last week. You get in a routine like, what has happened? Because all of a sudden the changes stop and brakes are on and you're in this routine for about 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But then another season of change happens when you're kind of my age. All of a sudden you become an empty nester. And that's the sole pursuit of your life. And all of a sudden, you're looking across the table and there's just your wife. And there's you. And there's not as much to talk about. And you've got a whole refrigerator full of food. Where did this food come from? Why isn't the 8 gallons of milk being drank in a couple days? What's going on? So you deal with that, and then all of a sudden it's like, what are we going to do? You wind up as a grandparent, and you're excited about it as a grandparent. And as you're taking care of the grandkids, all of a sudden you get a call from your mom and dad, and we need you here. And all of a sudden you're caring for the grandkids, and your parents are having needs at the same time. And then you're looking at retirement, and then some health issues, and all that stuff starts to happen, and you go into another 5-7 years of a lot of change. So change is out there, and it can be tough. And so I was just looking for a biblical narrative or story to illustrate this. And I'm going to give a lot of points. And my thing is, listen to the Holy Spirit. First, we're going to talk about what the problem is. And we see this lady, and her name is Naomi. Say Naomi. And you read about Naomi in the book of Ruth. So, I might mess up sometimes, call her Ruth, but I'm going to try to call her Naomi most of the morning. I did okay in first service. Her name is Naomi, and we're introduced to her in Ruth 1, chapter 1, 1 and 2. And we read this. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, okay? Lack of food, just like a couple bad farm years in a row. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judea, went and dwelt in the country of Moab. And the certain man, he and his wife and his 2 sons, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And that's who we're going to focus on, Naomi. The name of his other sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Benjamin, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. And this is the first of a series of changes that this woman named Naomi goes through. She faced a famine, and they moved to a different country. That can be a big change. You're moving to a different country. All of a sudden, people are speaking different languages. You don't think that's a problem until you have to go to the bathroom and say, "Where's the bathroom?" I'm like, and they think you said something, it could get kind of humorous, but it's not always fun when there's a change of languages. There's a change of culture and customs as you move to a different country. All of a sudden, Piggly Wiggly is not your grocery store, and there's another change, and they eat different foods. Things you're throwing out, they're selling for higher. It's just weird stuff starts to happen. All of a sudden, there's a different school system that you're putting your kids in. Her sons have a little bit of age, but they might have been seniors in high school, first year of college. Different school system issues. There's a different sports team you want to cheer for. So this is change. How many people would agree? Moving to a different country. There's change, okay? We read on, Ruth 1:3. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. That's pretty big. Your childhood sweetheart, your love of your life passes away. No sooner have you got to the land of Moab and you got kind of settled in, you probably spent all your money to get there, trying to regroup, finding jobs and employment. Next thing you know, her husband, her childhood sweetheart, dies. And there's Naomi with her 2 sons. They have a little bit of age on them. Would that be like change? Would that be hard? Yeah, that's hard. Next thing we read is Ruth 1:4. Now they took, and this is talking about Mahlon and Chilion, took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Now, that 10 years, it comes up a couple times, and there's kind of a picture that maybe this whole thing took place in a 10-year period, maybe at the most 15, but there's some thought that it took place, this was a decade of Naomi's life. So her sons marry 2 daughter-in-laws, but they're foreign. And that's different. Sometimes we, marrying someone, maybe up north, like in Cowden or out east in T-Town, that's kind of hard because that's a different culture, but these are from a different country, There was a couple in Atlanta, and they had just 1 daughter, and they really invested into their daughter. Just really did. Jerry, are you listening to this? Okay, just making sure. They really invested into this daughter and just kind of coached her, and she was just that perfect child that wanted to please her parents. Pretty much did everything they asked, just that perfect child. And so they worked her through, all the special schools and all the classes, music lessons and tumbling, and they just lived through their daughter. And after she graduated from college, they talked with her. She says, "It's a good time now to go into the Peace Corps for a couple more years to develop yourself." And so she goes off to the Peace Corps. And so she's coming back from the Peace Corps, and they receive a phone call. And their daughter says, "I'm coming home, and I got married, and I'm bringing my husband with me." And it's like, where did that come from? What in the world? Our daughter's married. We didn't know anything about this. So, she didn't come in at Hartsville Airport, but a smaller airport outside of Atlanta. So she came in on a smaller plane after she came into the States. And so they're looking anxiously to see their daughter and this husband that she's married to. And they couldn't really see her daughter because the first man that stepped out of the plane was this real tall African man, about 6'5", and has this crazy headdress on and hair hanging out. He's got a bone in his nose, and they're trying to see their daughter. They can't see past it. He's got a bone in his nose, and he's got this bag of incantations around him. And lo and behold, he has a shrunken skull around his neck is his necklace, and this guy's got all this pain. And so he comes down, and they're hoping to see the daughter meet the husband, and she comes right in front of him, and she says, "This is my husband." First thing the mom does is faint flat on the tarmac. And the dad's like looking at her, "What went wrong? You misunderstood me. I said rich doctor. You know. Jerry, was that okay? Okay, just checking. So anyway, you know, sometimes our kids bring home something that's a little different than we expected, and she might have experienced that. Two foreign daughters, and you know, there's a language barrier and custom barrier, and they cook the turkey much different. In fact, they don't even cook the bird in Moab. You know, we won't talk about that. So anyway, so there's some two daughter-in-laws in her life. Do you think that could be changed? Oh yeah. Okay, let's read on. What else happened to this lady? Here we read in 1, 4, and 5. That 10-year period, it says both Mahlon and Chilion died. Both of her sons died. So the woman, Naomi, survived, and her two sons and a husband died. That is really tough. I imagine there was some anger at God there. Her financial picture probably really went bleak really quick. There could be a lot of grief, a lot of emotion. So here in this 10-year period, you know, they moved to a foreign country. Her husband dies. Then they marry her two sons. You know, she's really needing her sons, and all of a sudden they choose women over her. She doesn't have anyone to really talk to, some foreign women. And then her sons die, and here she is. And so she decides in 1/6 to move back to Moab. She decides, we're going to move back to Moab. And she read on Facebook that they were having grain and food, jobs were there. So she said, hey, I'm going back to Moab. I'm going to go back to my hometown. And so, you know, she moves back to her home country, her hometown. This is pretty big. And then Ruth 1:14, we read this little segment just real quick. And they lifted up their voices, wept again, and Orpah kissed the mother-in-law, and she departed. One of the daughter-in-laws gives her a kiss. Hey, I love you, love your son, but, you know, I'm going to stay here. But Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, clung to her. And maybe one daughter-in-law left her. That could have been a very good thing. Could have been a very bad thing. And then one daughter-in-law decides to go with her to the home country. That could be a very good thing, very bad thing. Do you think that would generate some change? This all in a 10-year period. Boom, 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 boom. And then 1:19, now the two of them, okay, so we see Naomi moving back to her home country into Bethlehem. The two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited. And that word is actually better translated surprised or shocked to see because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? 10-year period. Naomi, she left with her childhood sweetheart with a lot of hopes of landing another job, another career in another nation with two handsome, good-looking, eligible bachelors. And she's coming back by herself with a foreign woman, and she just did not look the same. She's gone through a lot of change. And this is where sometimes you go through this, and it can be because of failure, it could be because of success, you know, and we talked about routine, you know, where, you know, yesterday looks like today, it looks like tomorrow. But here she's in a situation, she's still trying to figure out point number 1, number 2, all these things that went wrong, and doesn't know what's ahead of her. And she would probably say, if I could have 2 days that looked alike, if I could have 2 years that looked alike, if I had any understanding of it, it'd be great. And I mean, she was low on money, low on hope, housing issues. She finds out, you know, she doesn't have a medical plan. She finds out, you know, her Sam's card has been canceled. You know, Verizon, she lost her cell phone. I mean, it's a bad situation as she's entering what's ahead. And so I think there's some lessons we can learn from her because the story turns out good. With a lot of people that go through change, it does not turn out good. They get bitter, they get angry, they get grumpy, and sometimes they implode. But it turns out good for her, and I think there's some points that we need to make. Number 1, Ruth 1:16 and 17, I think are very key points. And this is Ruth, the daughter-in-law from Moab, making this comment about Naomi. Entreat me not to leave you, Naomi, or turn my back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you from me. And I think this is the first point. Now, we're going to make 7 points, and like I said earlier, I believe the Holy Spirit's going to quicken certain things to you. There might be one point that stands out to you that you can use this morning. Maybe 5 years down the road, you might be looking for these notes, and I believe the Holy Spirit might bring it back to you. You might say, hey, I need to read the book of Ruth again. But this first point is something that's very critical, and this is what it says. Ruth 1:18. The one I just read. She kept a regular relationship with God, and it was evident to others. Something in Naomi stood out to Ruth, and she says, your God, I want your God to be my God. I want your people. There's something in you that's different than the Moabite people. I want that. She saw something. Somehow, Naomi, in this mix, had kept a regular relationship with God that was evident to others. I don't think it was preached at her daughter-in-law, but she saw the evidence that she had a working relationship with God. And that's sometimes hard to do and change because, you lose your regular, hey, I had a little room that I'd have my little devotion time. I had my little cup of coffee that I would sit down and go look out this window. And sometimes in change, you lose that regular room. You lose that little sanctuary. You lose that space. And it's weird with our relationship with God. Sometimes in routine, you can get in so much routine, you say, I don't want a routine with God. I've had enough of a routine, and I don't need a prayer time because everything's routine. I don't need one more. And we throw out our time with God. But in the same way we do that with change. There's so much change. There's just no place. And, my schedule's being shifted, and I'm being moved from here to there and there. I don't have a routine. But somehow, Naomi kept that routine and had a regular relationship with God. Interesting person in history is Susanna Wesley. And she had like 16 kids. How many people, talk about a floor moving under your feet. I mean, the whole house was moving. There's probably no quiet space. And a lot of change she faced. But one thing she taught her kids and one thing she did is the only place she could find of solitude was she would sit down in a chair and she'd take her apron, pull it over her head. And that's where she'd have her Bible study time. Under that apron is where she had her prayer time. And she taught the kids, do not mess with me. When you see the apron over her head, stay clear because I'm with God. And she did that. And she kept her sanity. And she did some incredible things with her life. Raised some world-changing kids like John and Charles Wesley and a couple daughters that did some incredible things. But she knew the importance of having that quiet time. And sometimes it was late at night, sometimes in the middle of the day, sometimes it was morning because there was so much change. But she would make place for God. And that's the most powerful point. The other thing that I see in here, in 1:18, we see a second point. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, Naomi noticed that as she was leaving Moab, coming back to Israel, that Ruth really wanted to go. She stopped speaking to her and let her come with her. And I think the second point is important. She still allows space for someone to be a part of her life. And I think that's important when you go through change, especially hard change. Still allow space for people to be a part of your life, good, bad, and ugly. Sometimes when we go through a lot of change, death and job change and moving and all this, I had a good, I run through this where you have a best friend and then you lose them and you have to start over again. Make a best friend and lose them. And you get to a place where, why try? Why try? And you start slamming the door, you start closing yourself, you start growling and grumping at people, you start to grow bitter. It's like, I don't need people in my life, I don't need God. And we start isolating ourselves. It's a very dangerous place when you go through a lot of change and let me cut people out. I don't need another church. I got burnt by the last church and I got burnt by this person and this didn't turn out right. I was a part of a really good church, now I moved to another town, now I got to look for another church. I just don't want to do that again. And you go through that. And that's why I want to encourage young people. Sometimes as you move and you go through all this change, one of the first things, this to me, when you go off to college, the first thing you need to do is you need to find a solid group of believers. I mean, that's more important than finding, a restaurant or finding the bathroom or the dorm. Find a good group of believers to hang out with. It's important. And this is one thing we see in the story is Naomi allowed space to be part of her life. She allowed Ruth, her daughter-in-law, to be in that space. The other thing we see in 2:19 through 22, and we won't read that, but I want to make this point. She realized the guardian redeemer power of family. What does that mean? when they came in to Bethlehem, when they came back from Moab, they had, I don't know where they were staying, but they had no food. And so Ruth says, I'll go out. They're gleaning the harvest right now. I'll go out and see if I can find some grain. And it was a common practice in those days that the poor would go out after a field was cleared or after the gleaners had been through rows, that poor people would go and try to find, extra grain on the ground that was dropped or whatever. And they'd work really hard and, a couple pieces here, a couple pieces here, but they'd get enough to make some bread for that day. So the first place she went was in the fields of a man called Boaz. And so she goes out in this field of Boaz, and she doesn't know who Boaz, has no idea who Boaz is, but she starts looking, and Boaz notices her coming behind the gleaners. And he talked to found out who she was, that she was actually a relative. That he was actually a relative of Naomi, and he knew that this girl had come back with from Moab. So he told his gleaners, he says, I tell you what, let her come up close as you're gleaning and just be sure to just drop some extra grain behind. Let's take care of her. Let's protect her, where she'll keep coming back here day after day, and she won't go to someone else's field where she might not be safe. Because I'm a relative, I want to take care of her, because her, Naomi, is a relative of mine. A close relative. I want to take care of her. And there's power when you go through change of having a good, healthy family unit. There's all families are dysfunctional. I hope you know that. Every family, some of you have experienced a lot of dysfunction over the last few days, and just cheer up, because it's going to happen again before the December's out, But trying to keep that as healthy as possible. And it goes both directions, both you to your relatives and your relatives to you. But when you get in a hard time, family, there's power, there's strength in a family. They have the ability to really help you out in tough times. And there's some of the few people, moms sometimes are some of the few people that will love you. When no one else loves you, it seems like somehow a mom can still love you. And so, but what I've seen, and through the years, both here and different places I've lived, I've dealt with a lot of homeless people. And homeless people, there's one common denominator. They've all burnt bridges with their family. You'll ask, where are your parents? They're not around. Where's your sister? They don't talk to me anymore. Where's your brother? Oh, I haven't seen him in a year. Where's your cousin? And they cut ties. And when you get in a time of change, you really need family. So having said that, I want to encourage you how very, very important it is, even with your parents. Sometimes your parents drive you crazy, but look back and be there and stay close. I've helped navigate a few people in this congregation, in this town, that maybe haven't talked to their dad for 20 years or brother for 30 years. And a lot of times when you do, it turns out really good. Sometimes it hasn't turned out really good, but at least to make that attempt, at least to make that try, because when you go through a season of change, there's power in family. So when Naomi heard that Ruth was finding grain around a very close relative, she got kind of excited. She says, oh, he is actually a kinsman redeemer. He has the power to affect our life. And sometimes we're in a position, sometimes we're not in the Naomi position, but sometimes we're in the Boaz position, and you might have a niece or nephew that there's no way the family is reaching them, but you might come alongside their parents and really help that niece or nephew. You have a lot more clout than you think, and sometimes you can help be that kinsman redeemer and redeem them out of destruction. And so the other thing I see here, another point that stood out to me, Ruth 3:1, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well for you? And so this next point, I see during this time of change, she ministered to other people. And this is huge. When you go through a lot of change and you're thinking about, woe is me, this is not right, this is not right, some of the best way, one of the most powerful ways to break out of depression and inwardness is to look out and say, how can I bless someone? How can I serve someone? And as she looked up, here she's a widow. And she could have been all about herself and want to go to widowwooking.com, look for another widow to marry, but she was more concerned with her daughter-in-law, Ruth. I need to find stability for you. And she put a lot of thought into it. So that's another thing that helps during change. And then another interesting thing, the next point I'd like to make here is she discovered and shared God's plan. You can see that she was spending time with God. And as she was concerned for Ruth, her daughter-in-law, was serving her. She was praying for a while, seeking God's wisdom. And as she was seeking God's wisdom, God gave her a plan of instruction to tell Ruth what to do. She had been following behind the work crew of Boaz day after day during harvest season, and they're approaching the fall harvest celebration where they brought all the grain and it was a big celebration. And she said, God showed me something. And when you hang out with God, I need to tell you this, if you have a regular devotion with God and you hang out with God, there are times he'll just drop something in your heart. He will reveal something sometimes you were not aware of. Jeremiah 33:3 says, call unto me and I will answer you and show you mighty things which you don't know anything about. And there's times when you just hanging out with God on a regular basis that he'll show you stuff. He'll give you insight on stuff that sometimes you don't even ask about, or sometimes things that you've asked about. And it won't come like, we just go through life, don't spend any time with God, and all of a sudden we have a problem. Well, let me go see if God will give me some wisdom. It doesn't come that way. But if you daily worship God and get with God, kind of like Susan Wesley had that little apron, and you have that time multiple times a day where you get in and listen to God, there'll be times that he reveals something to you. And that's what happened with Naomi. She sees this Boaz situation, a very close relative, and knows that, he's single, a little bit older, and he knows that, Ruth is without a husband, and she says, hey, this is what God's shown me. This is what you need to do. They're going to have a big fall harvest celebration. They have that big celebration afterwards. Everyone eats, and then they fall asleep, kind of like Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving picture. Everyone eats turkey, and then everyone goes to sleep while the football game's running, around the TV, whatever. When that takes place at nighttime, you come and you get at the feet of Boaz, and you lay down at his feet, and God's going to take care of the rest. So that's what happened. Everyone fell asleep, 10, 11 o'clock at night or whatever, and Ruth came and laid down at Boaz's feet, and it said around midnight he woke up and felt someone at his feet, and he saw that it was, Ruth. And he says, hey, I'm your nearest of kin, and I need to take some responsibility in your situation. And we're going to start working on this the next day. And so the next point that I want to bring up, and this is what Naomi had to do in a time of change, we have to do. You have to trust God with his timing and detail. She didn't know how it was going to work out, but she had to trust God with his timing and detail. And Boaz was a man of authority, a man of movement and action. He started things moving, and he popped the question and said, hey, ask Ruth, this daughter-in-law, to marry him. And they got married, and God worked out the details, and he found a wife. She found a new husband, and life began to change. And the last point, kind of a beautiful point as the story ends, I encourage you to read all of Ruth sometime. She found new birth, new hope, and a new future instead of death. Naomi, she could have just been a woman of bitterness. And haven't you run into sometimes, you run into someone and they just snap at you, they're mean, there's a cruelness, there's anger. Lots of times they've gone through change and they haven't let God in there. And she could have just died early and just with bitterness, but she turned everything over to God. She kept walking with God during the change. And Ruth got married, and they had a little grandson who all of a sudden was the delight of Naomi's heart. She invested in him. That little grandson had a son, and his son was King David. Beautiful story. And it wouldn't have happened like it did happen if Naomi wouldn't have taken God with her during the season of change. Will you stand up with me?